Hi guys, and welcome back to Comics and Chill, where we are continuing the retrospective of the Millarworld comics universe. Now in the last video I covered some amazing comics. This time I got a bit more of a mixed bag for you. We will be looking at Chrononauts, Huck, Empress, and Reborn. Let's not beat around the bush, we'll dive straight in with Chrononauts. So this is a story about two scientists who create a time machine to travel back and observe key moments in history so they can study them in the present. Dr. Quinn and Dr. Riley, on their very first mission, they are going to observe Christopher Columbus as he arrives in America. And Dr. Quinn goes through first, something goes terribly wrong, and he gets lost in time, with Dr. Riley quickly diving through to go and save his best pal who's lost in time, only to discover that for years now, because of the time difference, Dr. Quinn has become some sort of warlord ruler in the past, using his modern technology, and he wants to stay there in the past because his life in the present sucks. And it's kind of a cool concept, but it's so loose and flaky. As you can tell, I could barely be bothered to summarize it properly. When I was reading this, I was thinking I think I might actually hate this book, which is a shame because I love Sean Gordon Murphy's art. He's a great artist. So Millar said that it started, this story started life as a short film that he would direct for Ridley Scott, I was quite surprised to find out. But then funding fell through, and Millar was telling another studio exec about it who wanted to buy this idea as a feature film, but Millar insisted that this become a comic book first. And production of the book apparently went very smoothly, with Millar having wanted to work with Murphy for a while. In conversation with Millar, Murphy had said he liked drawing cars and tech, so when this project came up, it was a perfect fit for him. And Millar said that is the least stressful experience he's had working with an artist, as Murphy's work was not only great, but it was on time too. And as we know, Millar's had a lot of experience with late artists in the past. Now, I was very excited for this book since it was announced, and when it was initially coming out, I did buy, I think it was the first 2 issues, but then I quickly tagged out. Everything I liked about this book was visual, and you can't fault any of Murphy's art in this. His page layouts and panel compositions are very interesting and cinematic. No detail is spared, and his style, to me, it mixes the best parts of manga and European comics together. And he's a master of drawing vehicles, architecture, and tech. His perspective is always on point. And Matt Hollingsworth, who has a long career as a colorist in the comics industry, does a fantastic job on colors here, using mostly flat colors whilst adding a lot of crunchy texture to things. And this art team has gone on to do wonderful things together if you read Murphy's Batman White Knight series. So what did I dislike about this? Pretty much everything else. The concept is a fun one in description, and if memory serves, it was being marketed as like a Top Gun meets Back to the Future, and they even go so far as to have variant covers for this series featuring homage images to Back to the Future, Lethal Weapon, and Top Gun. But this series was just poorly executed from a writing standpoint. In regards to the plot, it just moves far too quickly, and now granted this is only 4 issues long, and if I was to speculate as to why this miniseries is a bit shorter than other Millarworld books, it would probably be due to Murphy's availability. I remember when this book was announced, Tokyo Ghost was announced at the same time, which is another series written by Rick Remender, which Murphy was doing art on. So my best guess is that the amount of issues he could do for Millar were limited. So Millar has really crammed in the story here to the point where this kind of feels like you're watching a movie with every other scene cut out. It just moves way too quickly. But Murphy handles it all really well. The story needed way more work up front to develop the characters and to foreshadow some of the more emotional beats that come at the end of the story, but because that foreshadowing or work is just not there, these emotional beats then they just fall completely flat. The 2 main characters are vapid and are completely unbelievable as scientists or best friends. The only reason we know that they're these things is because we're told they're these things. So the only personality traits that they have is a sort of dude bro frat guy kind of thing, and they both have these characteristics, so it just makes them interchangeable, and they're just far too cocky and full of themselves to get on board with or to make you care about anything that happens to them. My favorite character turned out to be a security specialist named Mannix, who is clearly just Tommy Lee Jones drawn into this comic. He's sent back in time to hunt these two idiots down. And, he's very surly and hates the two main characters, much like I did. And he's more than happy to try and bring them in, no matter what. And I was kind of rooting for him. Yeah, maybe I would have enjoyed the series more from his point of view. And the plot being rushed is one thing, but like I said up top, these characters, I think they made me hate this book. And the one thing I can say positive about this is at least it was a pleasure to look at. So if you're getting this, it's just for the art, in my opinion. So next up, we have what turned out to be a nice surprise for me, which is Huck. And the concept of this is basically, what if Forrest Gump was Superman? The story is about a young man named Huck with learning difficulties who lives and works in a small town as a gas station attendant. However, he has a secret, and one that the whole town helps him keep to protect him and to protect his gift. Huck likes to do at least one good deed per day. That's how he lives his life, whether it's finding a lost item for a neighbor or taking a quick trip to North Africa to save some hostages. Huck has an uncanny ability to track items and people down, and also has incredible strength and endurance that aids him in doing so. However, one day a new and nosy neighbor blows his secret to the press, and all of a sudden a lot of people want favors from him. It also brings him to the attention of some very, very bad people that have been looking for Huck for many years. So Millar created this book in response to seeing the Zack Snyder film The Man of Steel, and he said that he had definitely had a fun time in the past and made a lot of cash off of contributing to the more cynical and violent superhero genre from the early 2000s. But when he was watching this movie, especially the scene where Superman snaps Zod's neck, he wondered to himself if we had come to the end of that road, and remembered why he fell in love with these characters to begin with, which was for their heroic kindness. Millar said, "I loved Superman as a kid, not because of his edginess or his potential for a fatal solution, but because he could do anything he wanted and still chose to be nice. This was always the moral of superhero comics to me." And so he created Huck, who was also inspired partly by a warm-hearted man that Millar had met whilst volunteering at a community service. In a conversation with the man, Millar learned that the man had learning difficulties himself, but was incredibly kind, living his life by the rule of accomplishing one good deed per day. And I hope that man got a cut from the sales from Huck. So initially, I totally dismissed this comic when it was being released. I did buy issue 1, read through it in about less than 5 minutes. It's very, very brief, like an opening scene almost. And I felt ripped off, and I just thought, forget this, I'm done. And also, for some reason at the time, I was not the biggest fan of Rafael Albuquerque's artwork. But this time around, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think reading it as a whole, it's not a heavy read. You can get through the whole thing in about 45 minutes quite easily. Maybe quicker, depends on your reading speed. But it is a really wholesome and heartfelt story with the vibe of a 1980s action-adventure story, which again, this, much like Chrononauts, they had variant covers for this, which paid homage to certain films that have a similar vibe. I already mentioned Forrest Gump. They did a Goonies cover and a Ghostbusters cover and a few others I'm forgetting. And like I mentioned, the opening chapter is, it's a breeze to get through, but when you get to the opening of issue 2 and it begins to give you hints at to what Huck's origin is, which I won't spoil here, I think you should read this, things get very intriguing and interesting. Had the opening scene of issue 2 been shifted to the end of issue 1, or if this series, instead of being a 6-issue mini-series, had been a 3-issue series with double-sized issues, there's a good chance I would have stayed on board with the initial release. But sitting down and reading through it all in one go, it was an absolute delight. And as for me not being a fan of Albuquerque's art before, I don't know what I was thinking. At the time, all I'd really seen of his was his early American Vampire stuff, and I even went back to look at that before recording this review to see what I thought about it, and it looked great. I don't know what my problem was. I think the soft, sort of washy nature of his line work does wonders for this book, and the acting and action and the weight that he's able to give his characters feels very organic. And a lot of the time this book had me thinking of Superman for All Seasons by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. Millar did mention that he and Rafael Albuquerque had 18 issues planned for this, split into 3 6-issue story arcs, but there have been no further books in this series, although the duo has gone on to produce 2 volumes of another Millarworld series called Prodigy. But I'd love to see more volumes of Huck. I don't want to spoil it to you, but his origin was interesting to me, and yeah, I think I was just more of a cynical old git before, because I really loved this story. I actually read it twice, so there you go. Alright, so next up we have Empress. This story is set 65 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, amongst a thriving empire that lived alongside the dinosaurs. and it follows Emporia, the queen of a brutal king who wishes to escape from him along with her 3 children. With the help of the head of her guard, Captain Havelock, the group race across the galaxy to get to a safe house that King Morax has no idea exists. However, along the way, as they hop from planet to planet, they run into trouble time and time again. Now, what I've just described is a very simple plot, but this is a very fun book and another sleeper hit for me amongst the gaps in my Millarworld reading. Initially, when this was released, I skipped it and I knew very little about it before recording this video. I had seen the cover for the first issue when it was released, and it looked kind of bland, to be honest with you, like bland and generic, along with like this just vague name. The hook that is usually there with a Millar book, you know, when he pitches these things, it was, you know, it never got to me in any of the marketing. And just going off the cover alone, I always just thought of it as, you know, generic Space Queen in Space book. And I just never got around to it. But it has turned out to be one of my favourite Millar books. Like I said, it's far from a mind-blowing or novel concept, but it's a damn fun book. Brilliantly paced with killer art and action. A lot of the credit being owed to Stuart Immonen and his mastery of the comics craft here. I've been a fan of his for a long time. Each issue essentially takes place on a different planet with completely new species, creatures, cultures, plants, tech and architecture. And Immonen has had to design all of this from the ground up, sometimes just for a few panels. But he never skipped on the detail and makes it all work together so smoothly. He said he spent about 2 or 3 months prior to beginning to draw actual pages just designing the series, filled over 3 or 4 sketchbooks full of designs. And his storytelling, especially the action scenes, are incredibly engaging, with Immonen saying that the relentless pace of the series was one of his favourite parts of drawing it. Early in his career, Millar had briefly worked with Immonen before, dialoguing some Superman books that Immonen had drawn, and the two had always wanted to work together, but it took a while for the timing to work out, as Immonen was always busy, tied up with more recent like X-Men or Star Wars, that sort of stuff. But eventually things worked out, and when Millar approached him with a pitch for a family-oriented sci-fi book that would appeal to a wider audience, Immonen was on board. Now, the idea came to Millar from a few different places. Number one was a desire to lean a little bit more into sci-fi after working on Starlight, and number two was a realization that outside of Star Wars, there had not been a lot of sci-fi franchises with wide appeal. Now, there'd been Alien and Blade Runner, which had really influenced storytellers and filmmakers into a sort of more dystopian future area of sci-fi, and Millar wanted to create the antithesis to that. And number three, he had a Flash Gordon poster in his bedroom and noticed that there were a few of Ming the Merciless's concubines painted in small in the background, and he wondered what their stories would be. He then combined some of the more domestic drama elements that you find in a lot of British television shows. In this case, a woman wanting to escape her overbearing husband and feeling that this human situation is something that a lot of people could relate to. I guess he chucked all this into a blender and presto, you got Empress. I don't know. But I would never have guessed any of those elements as being an influence on this. My assumption was that he wanted to just basically create his own IP that would be akin to the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie or just Star Wars. But Guardians of the Galaxy had been released just 2 years prior to this Empress series coming out. The villain definitely has a Thanos vibe, and his wife kind of has some Gamora things going on, and the male lead has the Peter Quill look. So yeah, that's where I thought it was coming from, but apparently it's that other stuff. So the only downsides I can think of for this book was there could have been a bit more development of Captain Havelock, the male lead character. His background is teased for a sequel, which, you know, we haven't got yet. I would love a sequel to this. And there's a last minute twist at the end of the story with one character, which I felt is quite silly. There's no foreshadowing towards it, or maybe a tiny bit. It was basically like a piece of information that was withheld from everyone, other characters in the story and the readers included, just so they could wrap up the plot with this little quick twist, which was a bit daft. I won't spoil it here, and it's not a deal breaker for me. It's just something that kind of stuck out, as the rest of the story felt to be very cohesive. Okay, and lastly, we have Reborn by Mark Millar and Greg Capullo. The story follows Bonnie Black, and in the beginning of it, she's an elderly woman in a hospital recovering from a stroke, and she has lived her life with no faith or belief in any kind of afterlife. And as she realizes she's at the end of her life, she is terrified to even fall asleep for fear that she won't wake up. And eventually she does suffer another stroke and passes away, only to wake up in a fantasy sci-fi landscape called Adistria that is trapped in a battle between good and evil. And not only is she in this strange new land, but she is also 25 years old again. She quickly discovers that this is the place where people go when they die, and she meets her father, some old friends and neighbors, and even her pet dog from when she was a kid. However, the person she's really hoping to meet, her husband, Harry, who was the victim of a murder about 15 years before her death, is nowhere to be seen. And she's eager to find him, but everyone else around her has been waiting for her arrival, as she's been prophesized to be the chosen one who can end this war between good and evil. So she sets out with her father and dog to do both, find her husband and end the war. And if all that sounds like a pretty bland and generic fantasy fair to you, it's because it is. This world that Mark Millar's created, its characters and concepts, they're all so half-baked that I struggled to stay engaged reading each issue. And I remembered why I never finished collecting the series when it came out. I'm a big fan of world building, especially in a fantasy or sci-fi setting where you can see a creator's really dug deep to really flesh out the logic of the world he or she is creating from scratch. And unfortunately, you'll find none of that effort in this story. All the rules and logic in Adistria they're just so arbitrary that it completely fails to engage the reader. Why does Bonnie wake up in Adistria at age 25? Just because? Why is she the chosen one? She just is. Why are some pets who have been reincarnated still animal-like, and others are reincarnated as humanoid warriors with animal heads? Just stop asking questions. Just don't ask. I mean, unless there was something I missed, let me know in the comments. But there are quite a few threads like this throughout the comic that when you start to pull on them, the whole thing unravels quite quickly. And many of these questions I had as I was reading through, and I assumed that they would be answered along the way. For example, my assumption of an explanation as to why everyone that passes away and is reincarnated in Adistria at completely different ages from when they died on Earth would be something to do with a significant event or physical or spiritual that they went through whilst at that age during their life. So if Bonnie did something significant at age 25, it has an effect in this afterlife, which is why she would arrive at that age. But now I think it's just written that way to have a hot young actress play the lead in the eventual movie that'll be made from this book. I had similar questions as to why Bonnie is spawned in this world and seemed to have had some sort of relationship with like nearly everyone that's around her, like friends, family, neighbors, etc., many of whom play key roles in Adistria, whether it's in like a leadership position or something like that. Like, is everyone reincarnated into the equivalent of their old neighborhood, like where that would be in Adistria? I don't know. Also, the world being a mishmash of post-apocalyptic sci-fi and medieval fantasy, like why is that? Like when Bonnie first wakes up in Adistria, she's beneath a huge like futuristic military gunship amidst a massive laser gun fight, like a huge battle that's going on in part of this war. However, the majority of the rest of the story utilizes mainly fantasy style elements. There are a few instances where you see landscapes which will include like castles next to a skyscraper or like buildings from a different culture right next to each other, and the characters will sometimes ride hover cars, but it is never explained why Adistria is made up of such a mishmash of genres and styles. I mean, objects and buildings don't die, so if that's the case, like why are they in? It kind of bugged me. Even Bonnie's costume in Adistria, it has like a retro sci-fi look to it, and her helmet even has this sort of Kirby-esque design to it. And don't get me wrong, it's a cool design, but the significance of this is just never explained. And that's just kind of like the world and its logic. With the plot, there's just a lot of tell, don't show going on here. You know, as Bonnie is on this journey with her father, he mainly serves as just a mouthpiece to kind of like blandly explain what's going on at all times. Like, for example, there's one scene where Bonnie and her father have been captured and they're being taken to a mountain to be sacrificed. And within the scene, as they're approaching the mountain, her father explains it's called Black Wish Mountain, where only negative wishes can be made, but to gain more wishes, the bad guys have to sacrifice people here immediately. And like right away, I'm thinking they're just going to wish for something bad to happen to their captors. Or maybe there's got to be like a complex ritual to making these wishes, but no, that's just exactly what happens. It's just like introduce the concept, execute the concept, next scene, and it's just irritating. I don't really want to waste more time poking these holes. If you read this book, you'll certainly discover them for yourself. The book did have a fairly strong start, and I was really intrigued by the juxtaposition of the elderly Bonnie's thoughts towards the end of her life on Earth, and how, as a young woman in Adistria, she reflects on how she lived her life and how quick all these important moments in life can go by. Again, it's not exactly brand new material to base a story on, but it is something that we can all relate to, and to hook the reader emotionally. But I don't feel that these elements were woven into the story in any meaningful way. I think were the actions in the real world on Earth and the lives people lived there having more of an effect on what happens in Adistria, I think that would have been a better move and would have gotten more out of this concept. But instead, it's just underdeveloped. Like, issues 3 and 4 are almost complete filler, and the ending is a fairly generic storm the castle situation. There is a very small twist at the end of Bonnie and her father's quest, but I won't spoil it here should you choose to read this. But I mean, you can already tell what I think of this book. The best part of it by far is the work of Greg Capullo's incredible pencil work, inked by Jonathan Glapian and coloured by, apologies in advance if I butcher this name, FCO Placencia. This was the main reason I picked up this book as it was coming out. I was and still am a huge fan of this art crew's work on Batman, and if you ever listened to any in-depth interviews with Greg Capullo, this is a guy with an insane dedication to visual storytelling. I highly recommend listening to his interviews he gave on Kevin Smith's Fat Man on Batman podcast a little over 10 years ago. He goes pretty deep into his process on how he directs a story visually, and he also goes into his life story, which at times was pretty tragic, but it's very inspiring stuff. Not only is he a great storyteller, but he has a wonderful balance between a traditional superhero comic style and a more animated cartooning style, with his finishes having something kind of like a post-image comics boom, that kind of line work, but with much better foundational drawing. But the weight and squash and stretch of his characters, they have a sort of cartoony bounce to them. And he has said in the past that some of his early influences were John Buscema, Frank Frazetta, and Mort Drucker, and this really shows in his work. But yeah, Capullo handles everything that Miller throws at him incredibly well, whether it be tech or more natural elements. But I really think his stuff shines best in this book in its fantasy elements, and he handles the wildlife and the flora beautifully, and also brings, you know, wonderful grimy textures to the darker areas of the story, such as like the bad guys' castles and prisons and so on. But yeah, it's just kind of too bad that like his artwork was kind of squandered on this. So I think you can probably already guess which titles of this video I recommend. It's definitely Huck and Empress, Chrononauts and Reborn. If you buy them, it's only because you love the art. Your mileage may vary, but you know, I was really disappointed in those stories from a writing perspective. Artwork is fantastic, you can't fault it. And as for how these titles tie into Big Game, as I mentioned in the previous video, I have read Big Game issues 1 and 2, so if you don't want any spoilers, now's the time to shut the video off. But in Big Game issue 2, the Chrononauts have already shown up, and if you've read it, you can see what happened to those guys. They've mentioned Huck in the story, and he's on the cover of issue 3. The fraternity are going to be hunting him down next. And I just saw the solicitations, the covers for issues 4 and 5, which features the villain from Empress on the cover of issue 4, so I'm really curious to see how that's going to tie into Big Game. I'm thoroughly enjoying the series so far. Let me know if you want me to review those issues one by one, or if you want me to wait and review the series as a whole at the end of this retrospective. But that's all I've got for you today, so take it easy and I'll catch you in the next video.